Inside Cuba, joining us is Daniel Lacalle, chief economist at Tressis Hedge Fund, international financial analyst, and author of the book Freedom or Equality. Daniel, good afternoon to you. So, as you're already aware, the country, Cuba, is in deep economic and social turmoil, driven by fuel shortages linked to certain aspects. Let me just get your first reaction to the latest news here that U.S. suppliers have shipped approximately 30,000 barrels of fuel to Cuba's private sector. So the emphasis here on private sector. I mean, in your view, does this suggest a plan to give private business a leg up over state-run enterprise? Possibly. Your reactions here.
Hi, Don. Absolutely. I think it's very important for a very simple reason. Anyone that understands what is happening with the dictatorship in Cuba knows that the dictatorship resells and steals the dollars that they receive from those sales of foreign oil and also domestic oil. They have been squandering billions of dollars from the internal production, which is around 32,000 barrels a day, but also from all the oil that they got for free from Venezuela and from Mexico. So it's absolutely critical that the United States, which is already the largest trading partner of Cuba in terms of medicine, in terms of chicken, in terms of food and health products, all these things, gives the private sector, with the very small private sector, but the important private sector, the fuel that the dictatorship is using to play victim, because the dictatorship is basically at the same time providing ample fuel, internet, and electricity to the flotilla that has gone to Cuba to promote the propaganda of the Cuba dictatorship that uses poverty as a way to play victim.
So, Daniel, I saw your article titled "Cuba Sank Because of Its Repressive Regime, Not Because of an External Blockade." Just talk to us a bit more about your article. I mean, what would happen if restrictions were lifted, U.S. restrictions lifted entirely tomorrow? What would happen to Cuba?
But let's start from the perspective that the Cuba economy was already in a completely disastrous situation before there was any sanction. That the sanctions are against the leaders of the dictatorship that squander and steal the money that they receive from exports. More importantly, what has happened in Cuba is very, very simple. The dictatorship uses poverty as a way to play victim. Cuba is the most subsidized economy in the world. It receives billions from Russia, from China, from Mexico, from the European Union countries. It has more than 27 trade agreements and bilateral agreements with the largest economies in the world. The EU countries have eliminated their debt and forgiven their debt commitments in numerous occasions. And what the Cuba dictatorship does all the time is to impoverish citizens so that they can squander even more money. So what is exceedingly important is that the regime is eliminated so that those sanctions don't need to exist. And more importantly, that at the same time, the Cuban people start to see the benefits of tourism, of trade, of industry, and all the elements that they deserve. It's incredible that people are saying that the problems of Cuba are due to the sanctions when the government has banned the import of medicine and food into the country. All these things need to be told over and over again because the propaganda of the dictatorship has always been the same in the past 60 years. The Cuba economy sank decades ago, and I'm talking decades. It has been a demolition of industry, of the trading sector, of everything that has to do with the industry and everything that has to do with manufacturing. And it survives due to the entry of capital for tourism that they allow in order to maintain the dictatorship's situation. And this is obviously something that needs to change, and the United States plays a key role here.
Right, as you said, this goes back decades. It didn't happen overnight just because the U.S. Put restrictions on the oil. And if the U.S. lifted the restrictions and the government stays the same, potentially nothing would change. possibly. So, I mean,
Exactly.
talk to us. Yeah. So talk to us. You said this goes back decades. Maybe you can highlight some of the specific policies of the Cuban regime or actions throughout the years that has led to the current economic situation.
Okay, number one, they completely abolished private property and they demolished anything that had to do with private businesses with policies as well, that every time that they allowed a little bit of the private sector to do something, immediately they would steal it and eliminate it again a few years after. So it's a constant process of erosion, creating a dependent and hostage subclass within the country that at the same time, the dictatorship has been using repression and propaganda and not allowing the citizens to leave the country. So it uses citizens as hostages. Since 1960, the Cuba economy was one of those that had all of the opportunities. It was a thriving economy, etc. And what we have seen since the arrival of the Cuba Castro regime, what we saw was first the demolition of the industry, second the demolition of manufacturing and trade, the obliteration of anything that had to do with a private, entrepreneurship and initiative. And finally, the other element that has been absolutely destructive has been this constant use of subsidies to maintain itself as a victim. I come back to the point. When the Soviet Union existed, it gave billions of dollars to the Cuba regime. The Cuba regime used it, on the one hand, to use a lot of that money to promote the dictatorship and to promote communism all over the world, and on the other hand, to enrich the leaders of the dictatorship. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia, China, the European Union, many other economies continued to support Cuba under the impression that that would be something that would put the economy back on its feet. However, what the dictatorship has been doing over and over again has been to generate a system which is equivalent to a kleptocracy. They consistently absorb any type of wealth and any type of economic growth or richness that comes to the island, and then uses repression and propaganda to continue maintaining this repressive regime that, I come back to the point, it was already in an absolutely disastrous economic situation way before there were any sanctions from the United States.
Okay, so Daniel, I'm not an expert on this, but what you said just now, does that lead to the inflation situation in Cuba?
Yeah.
I just want to ask you, how did inflation in Cuba get so severe?
Well, we have seen it in Venezuela. We have seen it in Iran. What does the Cuba dictatorship do? It's very simple. They steal the dollars that they receive from exports. They squander the money that they receive from subsidies. And then they print a currency that nobody demands in the island. So on the one hand, they maintain a certain level of reserves from the enormous amount of funds that people that have fled the island are sending to their families in Cuba, but at the same time, to continue paying the alleged subsidies and the things that they pay in the local currency, they print more and more of their own currency, leading to hyperinflation, because money supply growth is brutal, but at the same time, the reserve entry is very, very limited. And I think that is the key factor. The key factor is that what the Cuba regime does, similar to what the Venezuelan regime did or the Iranian regime did, is to maintain the idea of a very aggressive level of spending from the government, because they are doing it in a currency that is completely worthless. So to the extent that you can actually travel around Cuba and see the currency in the floor and nobody picks it up.
Yeah, I've seen images online of how much money you need just to go to the grocery store. It's crazy there. Yeah, this is very interesting discussion. There's another aspect that you mentioned in your article I want to touch on. You say the Cuban healthcare system is failing. So talk to us about this specifically. What's wrong with it? Why is it failing?
Okay, the propaganda of the regime says over and over that Cuba has the best and most open healthcare system in the world, that they have universal healthcare and that everybody has the best healthcare in the world, and that they export doctors. It is a complete fallacy. It's pure propaganda. What they do is that they have a healthcare system that is limited to the elite that are close to the dictatorship and the Communist Party and foreigners, but the healthcare that the average citizen receives is derelict, completely abandoned. And it's not only completely abandoned, but the little inflow of medicines that comes from the United States gets immediately absorbed by the dictatorship in order to provide to the people that are close to the government. But the average citizen has no possibility, to the point that one of the largest elements of imports that were coming to Cuba before it was banned was medicines, is that citizens that had escaped the islands would send to their friends and family the medicines that they could from the United States or from other countries. So it's basically a facade. They have a healthcare system that tells you and the world that is universal, but it's actually not universal. It's an absolutely demolished healthcare system that is available only in quality to the elite and the foreigners.
So, Daniel, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I just have two more questions here. President Trump previously said Cuba is going to fail. In your view, is the Cuban regime close to collapsing, or is it not close to collapsing?
The Cuban regime has collapsed many years ago. The only thing that happens is that the dictatorship stays in power through a combination of repression and constant use of these methods of propaganda and victimization. So the economy is absolutely obliterated. Many years ago, I wrote an article, Don't Forget Cuba, in 2018. It was already destroyed. No, so President Trump is absolutely right. But the problem is the regime. The problem is that there is a group of people that are making themselves multimillionaires by stealing the little amount of money that is coming from the subsidies from Russia, from China, or from the European Union.
Okay, just one final thing. How do you have a different regime? How would a regime change work, hypothetically speaking, of course, because the Communist Party remains the only legal party in Cuba, right? There's no official opposition group. And just if you could really quickly, after you talk about that, just real quick, what lessons can be learned from Cuba about centralized, controlled, or planned economies?
How do you change the regime? First, the opposition is well organized, but you need to have a process just like what we're seeing right now in Venezuela. So it needs to be a monitored and doctored process in order to come back to democracy. So that's the way in which you do it. What are the lessons? The lessons is that every time that you allow communism as an experiment, it stays for decades, even if it fails completely, as we have seen in Cuba. And the lesson from Cuba is that socialism never works, even if it gets billions in subsidies and free oil.
Yeah, I mean, that is so true. Even if it fails, communism, it stays for decades. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.